Okay, so we begin today. So we are entering the next phase in the history of the English language. Okay, so we now know that English is basically a Germanic language. The Germanic language belonging to the West Germanic subfamily. All right. So we also know that the Germanic family is one among the 8 or 10 uh, branches of the Indo-European family. All right. But this is a big but. So when you think about the English language, when you browse a dictionary, just turn the pages. Okay. And you'll see that more than half of the words in the English language, okay, are derived from French. So, how did this happen? French, as we know, is a Latin or Italic language. Both names are applied for this family, Latin or Italic. And English is basically a Germanic language. How did so many words arrive from French? So please remember that this is not an isolated example. Take Malayalam, for example, the language that we speak at home. So if you look at the vocabulary of Malayalam, you'll discover that more than half of the words have come from Sanskrit. Okay, even very ordinary words we use like Nagam, Sukham, all these are from Sanskrit. If you analyze a small paragraph of written Malayalam, you'll discover this very easily. Okay. So, how did this happen? Because of the overwhelming influence of the Indo-Aryan language Sanskrit on Malayalam. Although Kerala was almost never ruled by Indo-Aryan dynasties, Sanskrit was a big cultural influence in the formative stage of Malayalam. Okay, so that's why we have so many words of Sanskrit in Malayalam. Similarly, uh, French was a big influence on English during the medieval period. So by medieval period, we mean roughly the period from the end of the 11th century, 1066, when William the Conqueror, who came from Normandy in France, conquered England. And that is said to have begun the medieval period in England or the Middle English period in England, where you have the swift change from Old English. So, Middle English, you can say, roughly began at the end of the 11th century. It's a rough idea. Okay, all of a sudden you don't see the change. English was transformed over 3 or 4 centuries during the medieval period into what we have now. So, what are the historical reasons for this? If you look at uh, let me see. Okay. Yeah, I'll show you those later. Right. Okay. I think all of you have heard of the poem Dover Beach. I think you remember the author who wrote Dover Beach.
Matthew Arnold.
Uh, yes, once again, Dover Beach.
Matthew Arnold.
Okay, fine. So, what is the poem about? Matthew Arnold talks about ignorant armies clashing by the night. Okay, so Dover was a big battlefield. Okay, a battlefield in England for a long time because it was the closest point to France. Okay, if you can think of these two countries as separated by a channel called the English Channel, these are two countries separated by the English Channel. So, uh, what brings them very close is the very short distance of 42 kilometers, just 42 kilometers. You look up the map of France and you look up the, I can't share it now, there's some problem in connectivity, otherwise I could have shown you. So from Dover, if you stand on the Dover cliffs, high hills on the coast, cliffs, rocks. If you stand on the cliffs of uh, Hello, I'm back. Yeah, can you hear me now? Hello?
Yes, sir.
Okay, okay.
Yes, sir.
There's some disturbance at the same. Okay. So we were talking about the two places which are the closest between them. One of them is Dover, about which Matthew Arnold wrote a poem. And the other is Calais, Calais, which is on the French coast. So if you stand on the cliffs of Dover on a clear night, you can see the lights at Calais. And today, these two places are connected by an undersea railway, which is called Channel, Chunnel. It's also called Eurotunnel, Eurotunnel. It's a very crowded route, plenty of trains, and sometimes motor vehicles put in goods train and crossed over to the other side. So if you use this facility called the Euro Tunnel, you can reach Paris from London in just 2.5 hours. I'll send you the video links. You can see that. So history has kind of utilized these geographical proximity. Okay, so that France and Britain are even more nearer today than they were in the 11th century. But even in the 11th century, when William the Conqueror crossed over to England, it was uh, pretty nearer than any other place on both sides of the English Channel. So that is why uh, large groups of people always cross the English Channel from Calais to Dover. All right. So this is the historical background. And you will learn about William the Conqueror later. He was related by marriage to an English king. Okay, not exactly English. The English king was actually a Scandinavian who had attacked, whose father had attacked England and had settled in England. But anyway, he was naturalized and became an English king. So that is history. You'll learn more about it when you read about William the Conqueror. But we are talking about the influx of French words into the English language and to the creation of what is called Middle English. All right. So Middle English was the result of the amalgamation of Norman French and English, the original language of the English people. So remember, the very word language is of French origin. The Anglo-Saxon word was tongue, Tongue, which is still used in the expression mother tongue. When you talk about mother tongue, you use uh, the word tongue in this sense, language. Okay, so okay, yeah. So the word tongue is means exactly the same as language. Okay. So mother tongue meaning your native or your home language. Okay. So if you look up the dictionary, any dictionary, as I said, you'll find uh, thousands of words of French origin which we use every day. All right. So William the Conqueror's advent, William the Conqueror's arrival in England with a large number of soldiers and later on the aristocracy of his native land called Normandy. Okay, so it was a province in France inhabited by people who were originally a Germanic speaking people, Scandinavians. Okay, the Normans were actually Scandinavians who had settled in France and adopted the French language. All right. So the Normans were naturalized French people. They who had come from Scandinavia. Okay. So by blood they were closely related to the English people, but they now spoke a very different language. All right. Now, the Normans actually, apart from changing the English language, they also changed English society. So how did they change English society? They changed English society by introducing a new social structure, which we today call medieval feudalism or just feudalism, FEUDALISM. Talism, a feudal social structure which was imported from uh, France by the Normans. So I said that in an earlier class, I said that the Anglo-Saxons, the Old English people, uh, still had a fluid social structure, meaning you can become rich by efforts. You can own land. Although there was a class system, I said there are mainly two classes of people, the Aeols and the Chaols. Okay. But the class system or social hierarchy, ups and downs, people in the at the upper level of society, people below, it had not crystallized so much. Whereas in Norman society, in Norman English society or medieval English society, you had an almost rigid social order. So, what was the social order like? That the Norman invaders, Norman conquerors established in England. Let us see. So, for one thing, the king was at the top, right? The king was the supreme power. But also remember that the king was not as powerful as the king was in Old English times because the king had a large number of aristocrats or nobles under him who were also powerful. Because although the king owned all land, theoretically, uh, it was possessed by the uh, nobles, aristocrats. The land was in the hands of the aristocrats. And you'll find that in many cases, medieval kings did not have a standing army. So, what is a standing army? A standing army is a regular army, paid and maintained by the king. Okay, like our army, Indian army. It's a permanent thing. There are soldiers in the army who are paid by the government, get a regular salary. In medieval England, the king had very few regular soldiers. What happened when there was a war? When there was a war, the king sent word to his nobles, aristocrats, who sent him soldiers. Because the aristocrats had uh, tenants who worked their land. The nobles, they actually did not work their land. They leased out the land to tenants. And there were one or two layers of tenants, as we had in Kerala. കേരളത്തിൽ നിങ്ങൾ എടുത്ത് നോക്കിയാൽ കാണാൻ പറ്റും വലിയ ജന്മിമാര് അധികവും നമ്പൂതിരിമാരാണ്. അവര് ഭൂമി പാട്ടത്തിന് കൊടുക്കും. ആർക്കാണ് പാട്ടത്തിന് കൊടുക്കുന്നത്? പാട്ടത്തിന് കൊടുക്കുന്നത് അടുത്ത തട്ടിലാണ്. അവര് ഭൂമിയിൽ പണിയെടുപ്പിക്കുകയൊന്നുമില്ല. അവര് വെറുതെ ഭൂമി ഒന്ന് പോയി നോക്കും. അതിന്റെ താഴെയുണ്ട് പാട്ടക്കുടിയൻ. പാട്ടക്കുടിയന്മാരാണ് ആക്ച്വലി ദ റിയൽ ടെനൻസ്. ദേ വുഡ് ലുക്ക് ആഫ്റ്റർ ദ ലാൻഡ്. പക്ഷെ ഇവരൊന്നുമല്ല ഭൂമിയിൽ പണിയെടുക്കുന്നത്. ആരാ പണിയെടുക്കുന്നത്? പണിയെടുക്കുന്നത് ദളിതരാണ്. പുലയർ തുടങ്ങിയിട്ടുള്ള പല ജാതികളാണ്. അവർക്കൊരു അവകാശമില്ല. അവർ ദേ വർ സ്ലേവ്സ് ഇൻ കേരള. അപ് ടു 1865 ദേ വർ സോൾഡ് ലൈക്ക് സ്ലേവ്സ്. നമുക്ക് കേരളത്തിലെ അടിമത്തത്തിന്റെ ചരിത്രം അറിയാത്തതുകൊണ്ടാണ്. അപ്പോ ഇത് ഈ ഒരു അടിമത്തത്തിന്റെ ചരിത്രം എടുത്തു നോക്കിക്കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ നമുക്ക് കാണാൻ പറ്റുന്നത് the same thing prevailed in Britain. The king was at the top, the nobles or aristocrats were below them. Then you had the tenant farmers of one or two layers. And at the bottom, ഏറ്റവും താഴെ, there were people called serfs, SERFS. They were virtually slaves. They had other names like Kottars, COTTARS, villains, VILLIENS. So the modern term villain, ദുഷ്ടൻ, villain, ഈ പേര് വരുന്നത്
This comes from this class of people called the villains. It is a French word used for people who worked on the land, who did not have any rights on the land. They were landless peasants. Okay. So the landless peasants who inhabited the land, uh, they had many names like villains, quarters, serfs, SERFs. So they were landless people who simply worked the land to earn a living. So this was the social structure. See, the king at the top, the aristocrats just below the king, the tenant farmers below the aristocrats, or the landed, they were also called the nobility. And even among the aristocrats, there were two classes. The higher nobility and the lower nobility were called the gentry, GENTRY. ഭൂമിയൊക്കെ കൈവച്ചിട്ട് പക്ഷെ അത്ര തറവാടിത്തല്ല, അത് കേരളത്തിലുണ്ടല്ലോ അല്ലേ? അപ്പോൾ ദിസ് വാസ് ദി ക്ലാസിഫിക്കേഷൻ ഓഫ് പീപ്പിൾ ഡ്യൂറിങ് ദി medieval times. This system was actually prevalent in France even before it came to England. That is why the Normans introduced this in England. Hello, I hope you can hear me. Yes? Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Uh, the social system which the Normans introduced in England was called feudalism. And this is how feudalism worked. And parallel to this social system, which we call feudalism, the Normans also introduced a full-fledged religious order. So we already know that from the 7th century AD, most of the English people had converted to Christianity. Okay. And Christianity became established as the only religion in England. But the Christian church was not so clearly organized as it was later on in the time of the Normans. So the Normans introduced a system which closely paralleled feudalism. What was that system? Like the king, there was the Pope at the top. The Pope who did not sit in England but in distant Rome, at a place called Vatican. It's called Vatican. The seat of the Catholic Church is called Vatican. It is in Rome. Even today, it's in Rome. So the Pope was the head of the church, like the king. And under the Pope were archbishops. Archbishops are in charge of divisions of the Christian world into provinces. Okay. മലയാളത്തിൽ അതിരൂപത എന്ന് പറയും, കേട്ടില്ലേ? താമരശ്ശേരി അതിരൂപത. അതിന്റെ ചാർജുള്ള ഒരു ആർച്ച് ബിഷപ്പ് ഉണ്ടാവും, ആർച്ച് ബിഷപ്പ്. And below the provinces were other what is called diocese, DIOCESE, രൂപത. അതിന്റെയും താഴെയാണ് ഇടവക. In English, it was called the parish. So the parish was the lowest unit of the church organization. And the person who was in charge of the parish was called the vicar, VICAR. Okay, Malayalam വാക്കുണ്ട് വികാരി. So the vicar was in charge of the parish, ഇടവക. അതിന്റെ മുകളിലേക്ക് പോകുമ്പോൾ bishop, archbishop, finally the pope. ഇതായിരുന്നു സ്ട്രക്ചർ. അപ്പോൾ ഓർക്കേണ്ട കാര്യം, the church played an important role in the life of the people at that time. Okay. And ഇന്ന് വ്യത്യസ്തമാണ്. Today, only 5% of the British people go to church, probably even less. Many churches have been closed down. If you read Larkin's poem, Church Going, you'll find the church already strewn with cobwebs. മാറാലയൊക്കെ പിടിച്ചെടുക്കും, ആരും പോവാതെ വാതിലൊക്കെ അടച്ചിട്ടിരിക്കും. Because the religion does not play such an important role in the life of the English people today. But it did play such a role during the medieval period. Okay. And people are very closely controlled by the church. ഓരോ കാര്യവും പള്ളിയുടെ നേതൃത്വം, from your birth to your death. Okay. When you are born, you had to be baptized in the church. Mamodisa Mukkana. Okay. You will be taken to the church. The priest will anoint you with water, and which means that you are adopted into the church. അതാണ് ആദ്യത്തെ ചടങ്ങ്. പിന്നെ then you have what is called confirmation. 9 വയസ്സായി കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ അതിന് എന്താണ് പറയാ? എലിസബത്ത് എന്താണ് പറയാ? 11 വയസ്സായി കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ പള്ളിയിൽ പോലെ
ഹോളി കമ്മ്യൂണിയൻ ആണോ സർ?
11 വയസ്സാകുമ്പോൾ ആൺകുട്ടികളും പെൺകുട്ടികളൊക്കെ പള്ളിയിൽ കൊണ്ടുപോയിട്ട് അല്ലേ? When they are growing up.
കുർബാന അതാണോ ഉദ്ദേശിച്ചത് സർ? ഹോളി കമ്മ്യൂണിയൻ
11 വയസ്സില്ല, 12 വയസ്സില്ല. ഓക്കെ,
ഒരു 4ാം ക്ലാസ്സിലൊക്കെ വരുമ്പോഴാണ് വരിക.
So that ceremony was there. I think it is called confirmation. Yeah. What happens when you are growing up? Then of course your marriage consecrated in the church. കല്യാണം മാത്രമല്ല, മനസ്സമ്മതമുണ്ട്, എൻഗേജ്മെന്റ് ക്രിസ്ത്യാനികൾക്കറിയാം, in the church. So and then of course everything related to your life. വീട് വെഞ്ചരിപ്പുണ്ട്. When you're building a new house, the parish priest blesses your house. And when you are dead, finally, just before you die, you are administered a sacrament. 7 കൂദാശകളാണ് പള്ളിയിൽ, 7 sacraments. One of the sacraments is called the last sacrament, രോഗി ലേപനം. മരിക്കുന്നതിന് മുമ്പ് മരിക്കുന്ന ആൾക്ക് കൊടുക്കുന്ന ഒരു സമാശ്വാസം. ഇറ്റ്സ് കോൾഡ് the last sacrament, അന്ത്യകൂദാശ, കൃത്യമായിട്ട് രോഗി ലേപനം. And then finally, when you die, you are buried in the church. Okay. And some well-off churches had vaults for burial. കല്ലറകൾ, കുടുംബത്തിന്റെ ഒക്കെ കല്ലറകൾ. അത് നിങ്ങളിവിടെ പാലയിലും പോയാൽ ക്രിസ്ത്യാനികൾ കൂടുതൽ താമസിക്കുന്ന പഴയ പാരമ്പര്യ ക്രിസ്ത്യാനികൾ താമസിക്കുന്ന സ്ഥലത്ത് പോലെ നിങ്ങൾക്ക് കാണാം കല്ലറകളുണ്ട്, കുടുംബ കല്ലറകൾ. So the church was an organization which influenced or controlled people's lives from birth to death. Okay. So this organization, and we find that by the middle of the medieval period, the church witnessed corruption, which was there in Italy also. When you read Boccaccio stories, Decameron, പല കഥകളിലും കഥാപാത്രങ്ങളായിട്ട് അച്ഛന്മാരും കന്യാസ്ത്രീകളൊക്കെയാണ് വരുന്നത്. In many stories of Boccaccio, we find that there are characters. നമ്മുടെ ഇപ്പൊ ഇന്നത്തെ ചില സംഭവങ്ങൾ പോലെ തന്നെ അന്നും ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു. അപ്പൊ അതൊക്കെ that comes later, during the late medieval period, at the time of Chaucer. ചോസറുടെ കാലത്താണ് അങ്ങനെ പള്ളിക്കെതിരായിട്ടുള്ള ഒരു സെന്റിമെന്റ് വരുന്നത്. But the church played its role in organizing the people's lives. പിന്നെ ഞാൻ അയച്ചു തരാൻ പോകുന്ന ഒരു വീഡിയോ നിങ്ങൾക്ക് കാണാം. The church was also a protector of people. So how did that happen? So during the 12th and 13th centuries, there were raids by highway robbers and foreign armies. Occasionally, raids on villages. ഈ പട്ടാളക്കാരും കൊള്ളക്കാരും ഒക്കെ വരുമ്പോൾ എന്താ ചെയ്യാ? The people, all the churches were big, large buildings with large interiors. So when the robbers or soldiers attacked a village, the villagers ran into the church even with their livestock. കോഴിയെയും ആടിനെയും ഒക്കെ തെളിച്ചുകൊണ്ട് ഞാനൊരു വീഡിയോ നിങ്ങൾക്ക് അയച്ചു തരാം. പള്ളിക്കകത്തേക്ക് കയറുന്നു. So when they were inside the church, the vicar would close the church doors. നിങ്ങൾ പഴയ പള്ളിയുടെ വാതിലൊക്കെ കണ്ടിട്ടുണ്ട്, നല്ല കട്ടിയുള്ള വാതിലാണ്. You cannot easily break them down. So the villages would take refuge within the church. Okay. And this was common during the medieval period. So the church was an organization which closely influenced and controlled the lives of the people. And this was introduced in England by the Normans. അവരാണ് ഈ പള്ളി കത്തോലിക്ക സഭയെ കൃത്യമായിട്ട് ഇംഗ്ലണ്ടിൽ സ്ഥാപിച്ചത്. അതിന് മുമ്പും സഭയുണ്ട്, പക്ഷെ the Normans brought in this neat hierarchical system which was followed in Europe, which was followed in France. Okay. So this hierarchical system. This hierarchical system introduced by the church remained intact for a long time. It was broken only during the 16th century. We find that it was broken only in the 16th century. Okay. So, what was happening to England after the Norman invasion? The one thing that was happening, very clearly happening in England was the introduction of the Norman language, French. So, French was the language of the ruling classes. അവരാണ് French സംസാരിച്ചത്. People who came over from France or Normandy, as it was called, place was called. So people who came from Normandy, who had established themselves in England, mostly the nobility, they were also given possession of the land. So the English nobles were divested of their land. അവരെ കയ്യിൽ നിന്ന് ഭൂമി പിടിച്ചെടുത്തിട്ട് പുതുതായി വന്ന ആൾക്കാർക്കാണ് വിതരണം ചെയ്തത്. So the land ownership almost entirely became a Norman affair. Land fell into the hands of the Normans after the arrival of the Normans. And very early in his reign, William the Conqueror instituted what is called he had a book called the Doomsday Book written. So Doomsday actually today means something very different. What is meant by Doomsday? Yeah.
End
Christians.
of the world.
End of the world. ലോകാവസാനത്തിനാണ് Doomsday എന്ന് പറയുന്നത്. Okay. But for William the Conqueror, doom was simply judgment or accounts. ഭൂമിയുടെ കണക്ക് രേഖപ്പെടുത്തിയ ഈ പുസ്തകത്തിനാണ് Doomsday എന്ന് പറയുന്നത്. Doomsday book, commissioned by William the Conqueror. All right. So he made a survey of all the land in England. So please remember that only a small part of English land was cultivated. Much of English land was forest, കാടായിരുന്നു. Okay. And they were cleared for cultivation mostly only in the 17th century. അത് കാടായി, ഒരുപാട് സ്ഥലങ്ങൾ കാടായി. കൃഷിക്ക് വേണ്ടി വെട്ടി തെളിയിച്ചത് കുറെ കാലം കഴിഞ്ഞു. So William the Conqueror's England in the 11th century was a country which had just enough land to feed its people. And of course, during the 12th and 13th century, the population of England increased. Better cultivation. Okay. Bringing a little more land under cultivation. Okay. All right. So we are returning to the language. So as we know, the Norman language is in many ways different from the Germanic tongues. One important difference is the use of smaller words. Compound words are very few in French, unlike German. In German, you can combine a number of words into a single word, a compound, which normally you don't do in French. For French, they add something. Okay. Commissioner of police. Okay. The gendarmerie, commissioner, the gendarmerie. Okay. So they add this there of in between. Whereas what do the Germans do? The Germans combine the word, as we saw in the last class. Okay. A large compound word consisting of 10 or 15 words. The Germans have this habit. And because of this, the Germans introduced the large-scale use of prepositions. Okay. And today we have what is called an of construction in English. What is an of construction? Using of instead of apostrophe s. So you say, instead of saying England's king. You say King of England. Use of. Okay. The Commissioner of Health instead of Health Commission. Government, the policies of the government instead of government's policies. So the of construction came from French. So the English language was transformed in a big way by the introduction of a large number of prepositions. Okay. So everything depended upon the use of prepositions. Okay. So in, of, at, out, up, all kinds of prepositions which were used to connect words. So the use of widespread use of prepositions is a Norman invention for England. With the result that now you can have sentences like this. So for example, I can say, I don't know what it can be used with. Okay. ഒരു സാധനം കിട്ടും അത് എന്തിന്റെ കൂടെയാണ് ഉപയോഗിക്കുന്നത് എനിക്കറിയില്ല. I don't know what it can be used with. The sentence ends with a preposition. So purist grammarians, teachers would say you should never end a sentence with a preposition. I don't know if your teachers have said that. Probably not. That habit prevailed a little earlier to your schooling. So you probably didn't hear it. So the joke is about a teacher who said, okay, a preposition is not a good word to end a sentence with. Ending the sentence with a preposition, even while opposing the use of prepositions at the end. So the widespread use of prepositions was a characteristic of the Norman French language, not only the Norman French language, but other languages of the family also. The infrequent use of compounds, or rather the total avoiding of compounds as far as possible. Okay. Instead, connect two words by using prepositions. All right. So, what were some of the? We'll look at this in detail and just introduce this. What were some of the other characteristics of the Norman French language? One was, of course, the loss of inflections. Old English had a large number of inflections. Everything was inflected. Okay, you had inflections on the nouns, you had inflections on verbs, you had inflections on adjectives. Okay, so the Norman French, did away with inflections. So you did not have something like Godan man. Okay, you talk about two men, you say different form of the adjective God or good. Okay. As people still do in languages like Hindi. Okay. Achadin. Achi baat. When the following noun is in the feminine gender. You say achi. Acha. Achi. Ache. When the noun that follows is a masculine plural. Ache. Ache ladke. So many languages still follow a grammatical gender, inflections on adjectives, etc. Old English did. But Norman French did not do it, and because of the influence of Norman French, inflections almost disappeared from England, with a few exceptions. Like in the pronoun, for example, you still had inflections. His, if the subject was male; her, if the subject was female; its, if the subject was etc. Neutral. All right. So the loss of inflections was another important change. Yet another change was the loss of grammatical gender, as I said. Okay. The grammatical gender completely disappeared from English. So whether your subject is male or female, it made no difference to the form of the verb that was used. Okay. So just like contemporary Malayalam. In Malayalam, if the subject is male, you say vannu. If the subject is feminine, you will again say vannu. Subject is neutral, you say vannu. There is no grammatical gender in Malayalam. Grammatical gender is still prevalent in Tamil or Telugu. Telugu, say when the subject is male, you say Ochada, came, vannu. And when subject is feminine, you say Ochundi. Okay. And most nouns are either male or female, very clearly demarcated in Telugu. For example, electricity, current. Current vannu എന്നാണ് നമ്മൾ പറയാം. തെലുങ്കിൽ പറയാം current ochindi because it is feminine. Okay. So this distinction also the English language lost. Okay. And probably another interesting I won't call it change, interesting addition to the English language was the introduction of a number of words from the French, while the old English words were retained. Okay. So, for example, you can have a word like thief, which is Anglo-Saxon. Robber is French. Okay. And later on, at first the words were used in the same sense. Later on, there was a distinction of meaning. Today, a robber is different from a thief. A thief is a person who simply steals. A robber is somebody who breaks in, attacks you before taking away something. It's what we call, we talk about bank robberies, not bank thefts. Theft is something which is done stealthily. Robbing involves a large amount of violence. So, a large number of synonyms. Okay. You have synonyms for nearly everything. Okay. You have, for example, you say set up, and you also say establish. Okay. You have words for items of food, for example, like beef, for example. Beef in French simply means cow. Okay. Whereas in English, it is the meat of the animal which is called beef. Mutton, for example, is the French word for sheep. But when it came to English, it became the word for the meat of sheep, mutton. So this is how it happened. A large number of words, okay, introduced by the Normans in English remained in the language, and added to the total vocabulary of the language. The old Anglo-Saxon words did not disappear. Okay. They were not replaced. So what is the reason for this prevalence of Old English? The retention of Old English words. How did they remain in the? They remain in the language because the ordinary people still remain largely aloof from the Norman language. The Norman language, or the French that the Normans introduced, was mostly the language of the upper class. So, have you read any story of Robin Hood? Cinema കണ്ടിട്ടുണ്ടാവും അല്ലേ? പൃഥ്വിരാജിന്റെ റോബിൻഹുഡ്. പക്ഷെ ആ റോബിൻഹുഡ് അല്ല ശരിക്കുള്ള റോബിൻഹുഡ്. The real Robin Hood, who created Robin Hood, I think Walter Scott. You'll have to check again. So Robin Hood was a folk hero in medieval England. What did Robin Hood do? Robin Hood organized the ordinary Anglo-Saxon people, the small peasants, villagers, people living in the woods were all still very intimately attached to the Old English language. They never or rarely came in contact with French. French was the language of the ruling classes. So Robin Hood was an outlaw. രാജ്യഭ്രഷ്ടനാണ്. പുറത്തേക്ക് സ്വയം രാജ്യത്ത് നിന്ന് പുറത്തു പോയിട്ട് ഒരു ഗറില്ല ആയിട്ട് യുദ്ധം ചെയ്തതാണ്. റോബിൻഹുഡിന്റെ കഥ കിട്ടിയാൽ വായിച്ചു. റോബിൻഹുഡ് organized the people against the Norman rulers. So Robin Hood's tale is a tale of the resistance of the English-speaking people against the Norman invaders. അപ്പൊ അതുകൊണ്ട് തന്നെ അവരുടെ ഭാഷയായിരുന്നു ഈ പറഞ്ഞ English, old English, and a continuation up to the 12th century. Even at the time of the Norman rule, there were books or poems written in the traditional English language, which did not come under the influence of Norman French. Omulum, O-R-M-U-L-U-M, is, I believe, an Anglo-Saxon text. Okay. Written outside the establishment. അത് രാജ്യം ഭരിക്കുന്ന ആൾക്കാർക്ക് അതിനെ പൊറപ്പിക്കാൻ പറ്റില്ല. They would not patronize it, but outside their influence, the language still continued. And in the 20th century, there was an attempt to revive the Anglo-Saxon language. I mean, a language which was free of French influence. അവരെന്താ ചെയ്തത്? A writer, a linguist called C.K. Ogden, O-G-D-E-N, came up with the idea of basic English, which consisted of only 800 words. And he said, you can do everything you are doing in English with these 800 words. ഇത് നിങ്ങൾക്ക് വിശ്വാസം വരില്ല അല്ലേ? ഞാനത് എഴുതി കാണിച്ചു തരാം if I have free time. Because look at, I'll try to speak in basic English. Okay. So I will talk to you I'm using the word basic English. I'll talk to you in basic English. I'll try to get to you with my tongue, etc., etc. So get to you is reach you, using get plus to. A verb and a preposition, which is also called a particle. So get to, get at also means reach. Get to also means communicate. Get at, take out, talk into, etc. Talk into, persuade. Look out. Dig up. All these are pure Anglo-Saxon words. To dig up is to unearth. Unearth is more formal. Okay. So the exponents or the votaries of basic English said you can use a simple Anglo-Saxon word and a particle and get as many senses that you want. For example, instead of saying your exams are postponed, you can say your exams have been put off, take off, take up, take into, put out, to extinguish, put out a fire, put in, insert, etc., etc. So instead of using French words of French origin or more formal words, you can use simple Anglo-Saxon words plus particles to get as many senses that you want. So there is some truth in what the exponents or the proponents of basic English say. Okay, when they say that you can get by, I'm using the word get by, manage. Instead of saying manage, I'm saying get by. You can get by with basic English. You can get by using basic English. Manage. You can manage easily. So try that. If you get a chance to read the book, do that. Basic English. You'll find that it's a very convenient way of using English. And in ordinary conversation, I think many people use basic English. They very rarely do they resort to words of French origin. Although because of our social life, because of our professions, we are using more sophisticated English. But it's true that you can get along with uh, these words which are together called basic English. All right. Now, let's go on with the history of Middle English or medieval English. So, another obvious change which came about with the introduction of Norman French was a number of English sounds either were limited to certain pockets or simply disappeared. For example, Night. If I pronounce it as Nicht, you'll laugh at me. But that was the original pronunciation. The H is today present only in German and in certain parts of Scotland. Similarly, Loch is the Scottish word for lake, L-A-K. And they still pronounce it as loch. Okay, that guttural sound that you just heard. But it has disappeared from English. The English pronunciation underwent a drastic change, you can say. Many words began to be pronounced in the French way. In French, as you know, a large number of letters are silent. Okay. When you say bourgeois, for example, Bourgeois, the S is silent. Okay. When you say question, it is the same word as our question. So the last word is not pronounced as, last syllable is not pronounced as chin. It is pronounced as theon, question, instead of question. Okay. Robert, R-U-B-E-R-T. Both the R and the T are silent in French. In English, only the R is silent in some dialects, like the British. But in America, they say Robert. All consonants are pronounced. So the pronunciation of English underwent a drastic change. So you don't say though, T-H-O-U-G-H-T, thought. Okay. So why these unnecessary letters in the word? It's because they were there from the beginning. When you change your pronunciation, you can't change the spelling. It's not possible to change it because spelling has been recorded in books. So if you write T-H-O-T, and very few people will recognize the word. So you have to write T-H-O-U-G-H-T. Okay. So the change in pronunciation, the introduction of new sounds. Old English did not have Z, which is very common in English. It did not have J. Okay. It had Sh, yes, ship. But it did not have the sound which is used in the word pleasure. P-L-E-A-S-U-R. Pleasure. Leisure. Okay. And a few other words like V, fricative V. English had V, yes, W, but it did not have V. V came from French, Norman French. So V, Z, Je, and what else? A few more sounds like that, which came from French. Probably the long U came from French. And the oi, for example, in boy, diphthong, O-N-E. So a number of new sounds were introduced into the language. And the language lost some sounds also through a long period of Norman influence. So the loss of sounds, the introduction of new sounds, the increase in vocabulary, the huge increase in vocabulary. More than 50% of current English words are from French. So this is what's happening. The language is being transformed. The language is being completely transformed. Okay. So the conflict between the ruling Normans and the ruled Anglo-Saxons continued for 2 or 3 centuries. After which, the Norman invaders began to call themselves English. Okay. They settled down. They claimed to be as English as the natives. So, when after the 13th century, there were invasions from France. The English aristocrats, who are basically of Norman descent, they joined with the Anglo-Saxon natives to fight off the challenge of invaders. So by this time, they had considered themselves, they began to consider themselves as English. And the English language was restored as the language of courts. കോടതി ഭാഷയായിട്ട് after nearly 3 centuries, in 1375, yes, I think it was in 1375, that English again became the language of the courts. കോടതിയിൽ ഇംഗ്ലീഷ് പറയാൻ പറ്റുന്ന ഒരു അവസ്ഥ ഉണ്ടായത് അപ്പോഴാണ്. All right. So the 14th century was, you can say, a turning point in English history, when the Normans became naturalized, like the Scandinavians who came in the 9th century. അവരും സ്ഥിരമായിട്ട് യുദ്ധത്തിൽ ഏർപ്പെടുകയല്ല ചെയ്തു. They were also naturalized. They were naturalized and when they settled down in England, and their language also contributed to the English language. Similarly, the Norman language, the Norman French, which the invaders brought with them, enriched the English language. Okay. So enriched it on various counts. One, of course, as you saw, a large number of words which it supplied. So the English is today a rich language, containing at least 1.5 million words, probably more. Okay. And a large chunk of this vocabulary is Norman French. All right. So the Normans who had settled down in England, by the end of the 14th century, they had become fully naturalized. And the French language also contributed hugely to the literature of England, because they already had a rich literature, and they introduced many new forms into the English language. A certain type of ballads, what came to be called romances. Okay, so romance, the association of romance with love is actually casual. Romantic does not mean related to love. Love is one element in the romantic literatures or the romantic modes of literature. Most important thing is imagination. Okay. Imaginative tales. Okay. Narratives, prose narratives. So romance is generally a prose narrative. Imaginative narrative. Okay. And I think in French, the word roman means novel. It was an early term for the novel, which is a common English word today, roman. So what came to be called romances, tales, fictitious tales. But love was not the only element. Adventure was the more important element. Adventures, fights, okay, discovery, travel to distant lands, and what came to to be called the chivalric ideals. CHIVALRIC, chivalric or chivalry. Chivalry was a code of behavior. അത് നിങ്ങൾക്ക് എളുപ്പം മനസ്സിലാക്കാൻ ഒരു ഐഡിയ പറഞ്ഞു. നിങ്ങളാരെങ്കിലും ഒരു വലിയ പെട്ടി തൂക്കി ഇങ്ങനെ വരുന്നതാണ്, നിങ്ങൾക്കത് പൊന്തിക്കാൻ തന്നെ വേണം. അപ്പൊ ഞാൻ അതിലെ നടന്നു പോകും. എനിക്ക് പ്രായമായിട്ട് വന്നിട്ട് അയ്യോ ഞാൻ പിടിക്കാൻ പെട്ടി. ക്യാൻ ബി നോട്ട് ബിറ്റ്വീൻ ടീച്ചർ ആൻഡ് സ്റ്റുഡന്റ് ബട്ട് ബിറ്റ്വീൻ എ മാൻ ആൻഡ് എ വുമൺ. ഓക്കെ, അതായത് വലിയ ഭാരമുള്ള പെട്ടികളൊന്നും സ്ത്രീകളെ കൊണ്ട് പിടിപ്പിക്കരുത് എന്ന്. അല്ലെങ്കിൽ സ്ത്രീകൾ വല്ല അപകടത്തിലും പെടുമ്പോൾ സിനിമയിലൊക്കെ കാണുന്ന പോലെ ചാടി വന്നിട്ട് രക്ഷപ്പെടുത്തുക. ഓക്കെ, സോ ദി ഐഡിയ ഓഫ് ദി ഡാംസെൽ ഇൻ ഡിസ്ട്രസ്, അതായത് എന്തെങ്കിലും അപകടത്തിലോ ദുരിതത്തിലോ പെട്ടുപോയ സ്ത്രീകളെ വന്ന് രക്ഷപ്പെടുത്തുന്ന വീരനായകന്മാരുള്ള കഥകൾക്കൊക്കെ ഈ chivalrous stories. So one of the most established chivalric myths in English culture is that of Saint George and the Dragon. ഗീവർഗീസ് സാദ പാലക്കടുത്ത് അരുവിത്തുറ എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ സ്ഥലത്ത് ഒരു പള്ളിയിൽ, അത് സെയിന്റ് ജോർജിന്റെ പള്ളിയാണ്. ഗീവർഗീസ് സാദ എന്നാണ് മലയാളത്തിൽ. ഗീവർഗീസ് സാദയാണ് വ്യാളിയിൽ നിന്ന് ഡ്രാഗൺ ഒരു പെൺകുട്ടിയെ രക്ഷപ്പെട്ടു. ഗീവർഗീസ് സാദയുടെ ഒരു വലിയ കഥയാണ്. സേവിങ് എ ഡാംസെൽ ഫ്രം എ ഡ്രാഗൺ, ഒരു വ്യാളിയുടെ പിടിയിൽ നിന്ന് ഒരു പെൺകുട്ടിയെ രക്ഷപ്പെട്ടു. സോ ഷിവൽറിക് ഐഡിയൽസ്, ബിഹേവിങ് വിത്ത് എ, ഇത് മാത്രമല്ല, എ കോഡ് കോണ്ടക്ട് ഫോർ ഓൾ ഒക്കേഷൻസ്. ഇപ്പോ ഒരാളെ നമ്മൾ അംഗത്തിന് വിളിച്ചാൽ ഇറ്റ്സ് കോൾഡ് ഡ്യുവൽ, DUA, രണ്ടാളെ പോര്. അപ്പൊ ചില മര്യാദയൊക്കെ മറ്റേ ആളുടെ കയ്യിലും വാള് ആയതിനു ശേഷമേ വെട്ടാൻ പാടുള്ളൂ. ഇങ്ങനെയൊക്കെയുള്ള ഐഡിയാസ്. ബിഹേവിയർ, എ കോഡ് ഓഫ് ബിഹേവിയർ വിച്ച് ഇൻവോൾവ്സ് സർട്ടൻ സെൻസ് what is called modesty, chivalry. അത് തിരിച്ചുണ്ട് അല്ലെ. സ്ത്രീകൾ അങ്ങനെ ഒച്ചത്തിലൊന്നും സംസാരിക്കാൻ പാടില്ല. ചുരുക്കത്തിൽ നമ്മളെ ചില സദാചാര പോലീസുകാർ പറയുന്നു, നേരെ പതിഞ്ഞ ശബ്ദത്തിൽ സംസാരിക്കാൻ പാടില്ല. പിന്നെ in certain countries men are not allowed to go out alone. ഇതൊക്കെയാണ്. These are what are called medieval ideals. So in many songs, narratives, you'll find medieval ideals expressed, chivalric ideals expressed. ഇത് മൊത്തം തന്നെ ഫ്രഞ്ച് സാഹിത്യത്തിൽ എടുത്തതാണ്, from Norman French traditions. Okay. So Chaucer, Geoffrey Chaucer, who's often called the father of English literature, modern English literature. Chaucerയുടെ കവിത വായിച്ചാൽ, if you read Canterbury Tales, if you read his other narratives, The Parliament of Fowls, ഇങ്ങനെ കുറച്ച് കവിതകളും ഒക്കെ എഴുതിയിട്ടുണ്ട്. Both the themes and the narrative techniques are borrowed from European sources. Canterbury Tales നിങ്ങൾ പഠിക്കുന്നുണ്ടല്ലോ. Canterbury Talesനെ പറ്റി പഠിക്കുമ്പോൾ നമ്മൾ ഓർക്കേണ്ടത്, Chaucer was greatly indebted to an Italian writer. ആരാന്ന് പറയാൻ പറ്റുമോ? Chaucer's Canterbury Boccaccio. It's called Boccaccio, the Italian prose writer. And his works, ഒരു പുസ്തകം എഴുതിയിട്ടുണ്ട്, അതിന്റെ പേര് Decameron. 2 volumes. നമ്മുടെ ലൈബ്രറിയിലുണ്ട് കേട്ടോ. And Decameron is probably the source of Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, one great source. അപ്പോൾ Chaucer's tales are less rollickingly funny or blasphemous. Boccaccio ശരിക്കും പള്ളിക്കെതിരായിട്ട് ആഞ്ഞടിച്ച ഒരാളായി. നമ്മളിപ്പം അഭയ കേസിന്റെ വിധിയൊക്കെ എപ്പോഴല്ലേ വരുന്നത്, പക്ഷെ അതേപോലത്തെ സംഭവങ്ങൾ ബൊക്കാച്ചിയോടെ കഥയുണ്ട്. അച്ഛന്മാര് രാത്രി തലയിൽ മുണ്ടൊക്കെ ഇട്ടിട്ട് കോൺവെന്റിലേക്ക് പോയിട്ട് കന്യാസ്ത്രീകളായിട്ട് പിന്നെ സംഗമിക്കുന്നതിൻ്റെ ഒക്കെ കഥകൾ ചോസർ ബൊക്കാച്ചോ വിവരിച്ചു അന്ന് in the 13th century. He was describing a corrupt church, അക്കാലത്ത്. And of course, plenty of tales of adventure, romance, ഇതൊക്കെ ബൊക്കാച്ചിയോയുടെ കഥകളുണ്ട്. Chaucer actually borrowed many themes as well as the narrative structure. കഥ പറയുന്നതിൻ്റെ ഒരു okay. Chaucer narrated this in verse. കവിതയിലാണ് ചോസർ കഥ പറയുന്നത്. So borrowing another important poetic form, the ballad. A ballad is a long narrative poem which tells a story. So Chaucer's Canterbury Tales tells 29 tales. 29 കഥകളാണ് ചോസർ പറയുന്നത്. 29 കഥകളാണ് ചോസർ Canterbury Tales പറയും. Taken from, some of them taken from various sources, some of them which he created out of existing sources. It is, all these stories are bound with a narrative structure. Wherever കഥകളല്ല, of people who are going for a pilgrimage. അത് എവിടെയാ പോകുന്നത്? Where were they going?
Sir Thomas Becket's shrine of Thomas Becket.
Okay. Sir Thomas Becket's shrine at Canterbury. അതിന്റെയും കൂടി ചരിത്രം നമ്മൾ നോക്കണം. ഞാൻ പറഞ്ഞു, the church was a very influential organization during the Middle English period. അതില് ആ പള്ളിയുടെ പിന്നെ സ്വാധീനം ഉടനീളം കാണും. Sometimes the church had an extraterritorial authority over the people. കാരണം മാർപ്പാപ്പ ഭരിക്കുന്നത്, മാർപ്പാപ്പ റോമിലാണ് ഇരിക്കുന്നത്. But because of being the religious head of the people, he had sometimes an influence which overweighed the influence of the king. അങ്ങനെ രാജാവും പള്ളിയും തമ്മിലുള്ള സംഘർഷം, the conflict between the church and the state, അത് ഒരുപാട് കാലം തുടർന്നിട്ട് it was finally resolved in the 17th century. അപ്പൊ അന്നാണ് വേറെ പിന്നെ രാജാവ് വേറെ എന്നായത്. അതുവരെ the church had an extraordinary influence of the people. And sometimes the Pope forced kings to do many things. രാജാവിനെ പലതിനും മാർപ്പാപ്പയ്ക്ക് കഴിഞ്ഞു. And the story of Becket, Thomas Becket, the martyr, is also closely related to this context. So Thomas Becket said that his primary loyalty was to the Pope, not to the king. കാരണം ഞാനൊരു പുരോഹിതനാണ്, എൻ്റെ ഏറ്റവും പ്രധാനപ്പെട്ട എൻ്റെ ഉത്തരവാദിത്വം മാർപ്പാപ്പയോടെയാണ്, കൂറ് മാർപ്പാപ്പയോടാണ്, നോട്ട് ടു ദി കിങ്, വിച്ച് വാസ് Edward II in that time. അങ്ങനെയാണ് finally that was how Becket was murdered by the king, king's soldiers, and he was declared a martyr by the Pope. And the church at Canterbury became the center for pilgrimage. Okay. അതിൽ പിന്നെ എഡ്വേർഡ് രണ്ടാമൻ അതിന് കുറ്റം ഏറ്റുപറയുകയും കുമ്പസരിക്കുകയൊക്കെ ചെയ്തു. And later on, kings did not interfere with the church. And Canterbury was the seat of the church in England. സഭയുടെ പിന്നീട് സഭയിൽ നിന്ന് തെറ്റിപ്പോയ in the 16th century, when King Henry VIII established a new church called the Anglican Church, Canterbury became its headquarters. Canterbury became the seat of the Anglican Church. So the British Prince is today, even today, the nominal head of the Anglican Church. Nominal head of the Anglican Church, because by virtue of his being the monarch of England, Prince Charles is the head of the Anglican Church today. ഇന്ന് പള്ളിക്ക് വലിയ അധികാരങ്ങളൊന്നുമില്ല. It's a church, it's a seat of power, center of power only in name. It doesn't hold much power over the people, sway over the people. So, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is not an attack on the church, Anglican Church. Chaucer's Tales, Canterbury Tales, is just a series of stories with some fun. Okay, so when you hear about the nun described in Canterbury Tales, okay, when she wears a locket around her neck on which is inscribed the words "Amor vincit omnia," love conquers everything. Actually, it has been misread by a generation of critics who say that Chaucer was speaking with his tongue in his cheek, making a snide remark against her. Nothing. It's a regular slogan of the church which people wear around their neck. It doesn't cast any aspersions on the nun. Okay. But Boccaccio was more forthright. His tales can be considered direct assaults on the church in those times. So Boccaccio's tales, in any case, are owe much to the French and Italian narratives of his time and before his time. All right. So up to the 16th century, much of English literature, medieval English literature, owes much to European continental sources. Not only French, but also Italian. Think of the sonnet. Who was considered the founder of this poetic form? Sonnet.
Warton Surrey.
Who?
Warton Surrey.
Not Whiten Surrey. Whiten Surrey actually imported it from abroad. It was an Italian who is considered
Petrarch.
Petrarch, the Italian poet of the 13th century, is considered the father of the poetic form. The sonnet was introduced into England by Whiten Surrey. Okay, so almost at the end of the medieval period or the beginning of the modern period. So English literature, one must remember that Old English literature was purely indigenous. അതിന് മറ്റ് സാഹിത്യങ്ങളുമായിട്ടൊന്നും ഒരു ബന്ധവുമില്ല. It was purely an indigenous form of literature. ഇംഗ്ലണ്ടിൽ മാത്രം ഉണ്ടായ വിദേശ സ്വാധീനങ്ങൾ കുറഞ്ഞ ഒരു സാഹിത്യമാണ്. But the Norman period opened up England to Europe. ഇംഗ്ലണ്ടിനെ യൂറോപ്പുമായിട്ട് കണക്ട് ചെയ്ത ഒരു കാലമായിരുന്നു Middle English period. That's because of the frequent traffic between England and France. നിങ്ങൾ ഓർക്കണം, English kings owned territory in Europe. Calais, which I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, on the French coast, opposite Dover, on the English coast, was held by English kings for a long time. They lost it only in 1453. But there were frequent exchanges between the French coast and England. Intermarriages in the royal family. പലപ്പോഴും രാജാക്കന്മാർക്കൊക്കെ ഭാര്യമാരെ എടുത്ത് റാണിമാരായിട്ട് വന്നിട്ടുള്ളത് ഫ്രഞ്ച് കുടുംബങ്ങളിൽ നിന്നാണ്. Mostly Norman, but also other parts of France. Okay. And vice versa. So the blood bond between the Normans and the English people was strong. It was broken off only 1453. Finally, when England, and then it came to be known as Britain. When Scotland and Ireland was added to it, it became known as Britain or the United Kingdom. which is still its official name. Then the United Kingdom became an isolated culture. That happened only in the 16th century. After the loss of Calais in 1453, and after the coming into its own by the English armed forces. So the English armed forces, the English Navy, defeated the Spanish Navy, which was called the Armada, Armada, in 1588, during the time of Queen Elizabeth. Shakespeare was only a small boy when the English Navy defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588. But one must remember that this in the English and the Spanish navies was a turning point in European history. When the isolation of England was paying off, when England or Britain, it had begun to be called Britain considered itself superior to the Europeans, all other Europeans. And Europeans became a separate culture altogether. So what is a good example for this, which I can show you for the separation of these two cultures? Okay. When you go to some restaurants, you will find that the menu consists of Indian, continental, and Chinese food items. So continental means dishes which are common in the European continent. In England, this is what is meant by continent. Because they are an island. So they consider most European countries as the continent. So continental food. We are using the word without properly understanding its meaning, I think. In Britain, if you find a restaurant which advertises continental food, most probably it will be French or Italian. Okay. Other nations are also represented. But these two countries top the list, French and Italian food. Okay. For example, the noodles that you eat are, of course, Chinese. But the semia that you may use to make payasam is Italian. Vermicelli, it's called. You see this advertised in some on some packets. So the British or the English considered themselves separate from Europe only after the 15th century. Till then, frequent cultural and political exchanges were taking place between England and Europe. So Britain returned to the European fold only in the 20th century. The underground railway line between England and France, which is called Channel. Videos you can see those videos. It is the fastest regular railway line in the world, by which you can reach Paris from London in 2.5 hours. Fastest trip. A flight probably will take more time. Okay. So this is one thing. Second is the formation of the European Union. What is European Union? European Union is an association of European countries, which in many cases functions as a single nation, because there is no visa required between members of the European Union. You're not required to take a visa. You are given free passage. Okay. And if you get a professional degree in one European Union country, you can practice in all the other countries as a doctor, for instance. അതുകൊണ്ടാണ് പല കുട്ടികളും പോയിട്ട് ഇറ്റലിയിൽ നിന്നും യുക്രൈനിൽ നിന്നും ഒക്കെ MBBS എടുക്കുന്നത്. പാസ്സായി കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ നിങ്ങൾക്ക് ബ്രിട്ടനിൽ വേണമെങ്കിൽ പ്രാക്ടീസ് ചെയ്യാം. ഇപ്പൊ പറ്റില്ല. ബ്രിട്ടൻ has left the European Union. by a process called Brexit, British exit. But a few years ago, but you can still practice in other European Union countries. You take a degree, professional degree in medicine in Ukraine, you can practice in France or Germany. So this process of bringing England closer to the continent was I'd say, the most important process during the medieval period. നിരന്തരമായിട്ടുള്ള ബന്ധം between France and England, marital relationships, cultural exchanges. Okay, Chaucer knew at least 3 languages. Apart from English, he also knew French and Italian. അത് വളരെ കാര്യമായിട്ട് നടന്നൊരു കാര്യം. Most people were bilingual or trilingual. Narrow nationalism was not practiced during the medieval period. It was an international culture. അതിന് ഒരു കാരണം ഞാൻ നേരത്തെ പറഞ്ഞ പോലെ പള്ളിയാണ്. The church served as an agency or an organization that controlled people on the one hand and united them into a pan-European culture. European മൊത്തം സംസ്കാരത്തിന്റെ ഭാഗം. അപ്പോൾ the church had very similar organizational setup in all countries. If you had archdioceses, provinces, dioceses, parishes, etc. in England, you had similar structures in France. അവിടെ ഇതൊക്കെ ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു. മാർപ്പാപ്പ, ആർച്ച് ബിഷപ്പ്, ബിഷപ്പ്, വികാരി, ഇങ്ങനെ. So this internationalism favored the free flow of cultures, the free flow of goods, the free flow of services, the free exchange of ideas. ഇതായിരുന്നു ഇംഗ്ലണ്ടിന്റെ അവസ്ഥ. So what else was happening during this time? In the first phase, feudalism is basically a rural phenomenon. ഗ്രാമങ്ങളുമായിട്ടാണ് അതിന് ബന്ധം. The cities went into a period of decline. If you study European history, you'll find that the medieval period is called the Dark Age in Europe. Why? Because there is a decline in commercial activity. Cities were declining. People were becoming more rural. Okay. Society was basically rural in nature. Okay. Well, this is happening in Britain also. But England had some ancient cities. London was one of the cities, the capital of England. So London grew more and more urban during the Middle Ages. ഷേക്സ്പിയറിന്റെ കാലമൊക്കെ ആയപ്പോഴേക്ക് അത് വലിയൊരു നഗരമാണ്. How can a city grow? A city can grow in a number of ways. One, it can become the center of commercial activity. കച്ചവടം നടക്കണം. അപ്പൊ കച്ചവടം നടക്കണമെങ്കിൽ എന്താണ് വേണ്ടത്? You need money. You need large capital. So at the beginning of the medieval age, when William the Conqueror invaded England, the cities were in a very sad state of decline. അത്ര വലിയ കച്ചവടം നടക്കുന്നില്ല. Not many ships anchored at the ports of London. Very in ചെറിയ ചെറിയ cities, Plymouth, Plymouth, Bristol. Okay, small ports. They were in a state of decline. It was only in the 16th century, at the time of Shakespeare, the Merchant of Venice, the നാടകം കേട്ടിട്ടില്ലേ, Shakespeare's play. ആ പേരിലൊരു സിനിമ ഇറങ്ങി മലയാളത്തിൽ, which has nothing to do with Merchant of Venice-ലെ വ്യാപാരി, മമ്മൂട്ടി അഭിനയിച്ചു. But by the 16th century, many cities in Europe, especially London in Britain, had developed into a big commercial hub. വലിയൊരു കച്ചവട കേന്ദ്രമായിട്ട് വികസിച്ചു അപ്പോഴേക്കും. അപ്പൊ എന്താ ഉണ്ടായെന്ന് വെച്ചാല് മണി ഹാഡ് ബിക്കം മോർ അവൈലബിൾ. കാരണം കച്ചവടം ചെയ്യാൻ പണം. ദ മെഡീവൽ പീരിയഡ് വാസ് എ പീരിയഡ് മെയിൻലി ഓഫ് ദ ബാർട്ടർ സിസ്റ്റം. നാട്ടുപുറത്ത് നമുക്ക് എന്തിനാണ് പൈസ? കൃഷിക്കാർക്ക്, കാർഷിക തൊഴിലാളികൾക്ക് കൂലി കിട്ടുന്നത് ഇവിടെ കേരളത്തിലൊക്കെ എങ്ങനെയാണ്? നെല്ലായിട്ടാണ് കൊടുക്കുന്നത്. പൈസ കൊടുക്കില്ല. ഇത്ര നെല്ല് എന്ന് പറയും, വളർന്നു കൊടുക്കും. അതുപോലെ നെല്ല് പീടിയെ കൊടുത്തിട്ടാണ് മുളകൊക്കെ വാങ്ങുന്നത്. Which was called the barter system. Money was not in free circulation. So money became more available during the end of the medieval period. അതിന് കാരണം ഈ നഗരങ്ങളുടെ വളർച്ച, the growth of cities, the growth of cities in Europe. അതെങ്ങനെയാണ്? Cities grew by the efforts of people who were called artisans. കരകൗശല വിദഗ്ധർ, കമ്മാളർ എന്നാണ് മലയാളത്തിൽ. ഈ സാധാരണ ഉപകരണങ്ങളൊക്കെ ഉണ്ടാക്കുക, കത്തി ഉണ്ടാക്കുക, ജനങ്ങൾ ഉപയോഗിക്കുന്ന സാധനങ്ങൾ, വീട്ടിൽ ഉപയോഗിക്കുന്ന സാധനങ്ങളൊക്കെ ഉണ്ടാക്കുക, ഹൗസ് ഹോൾഡ് ആർട്ടിക്കിൾസ്, ഓക്കെ, പബ്ലിക്ലി യൂസ്ഡ് ആർട്ടിക്കിൾസ്, മരം കൊണ്ട്, ഇരുമ്പ് കൊണ്ട് ഒക്കെ ഉണ്ടാക്കുക. ഇപ്പൊ കാളവണ്ടിയുടെ ചക്രം ഉണ്ടാക്കുക കേട്ടോ. ഇതൊക്കെ ദീസ് ആർ ദ വർക്ക്സ് ഓഫ് ആർട്ടിസൻസ്, കരകൗശലക്കാരും കമ്മാളരും. അപ്പൊ അവര് ദേ ഹാഡ് ആർട്ടിസൻ സ്കിൽസ്. ഇതുപോലുള്ള കമ്മാളരുടെ സംഘങ്ങളുണ്ട്. എസ്റ്റാബ്ലിഷ് ദംസെൽസ്. അപ്പൊ നാട്ടുമ്പുറത്തുനിന്നൊക്കെ വല്ലവരും ചാടി പോവുകയാണെങ്കിൽ അവരെത്തുക ഈ നഗരങ്ങളിലാണ്. ഓക്കെ, സെർവ്സ് വിത്തൗട്ട് വർക്ക്. നിങ്ങൾക്കറിയാം, കൃഷിക്കൊക്കെ എന്തെങ്കിലും നാശം സംഭവിക്കുകയാണ്, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ക്ഷാമം ഉണ്ടാവുകയാണ് ഒക്കെ, ചിലപ്പോൾ ആൾക്കാര് ഗ്രാമങ്ങളിൽ നിന്ന് പോയിട്ട് എത്തുന്ന നഗരങ്ങളിലാണ്. വേർ ദേ വിൽ ഫൈൻഡ് വർക്ക് ആസ് ആർട്ടിസൻസ്. ഇതുപോലെ സ്ഥാപനങ്ങൾ ആൻഡ് ആർട്ടിസൻ. പിന്നെ അത് ഒരു സംഘമായിട്ട് മാറും. അപ്പൊ അവരാണ് ദേ ജനറേറ്റ് മണി ഓൺ ദ വൺ ഹാൻഡ്. അവര് പണം, അവരുടെ കയ്യിലാണ് പണം. അങ്ങനെ അതിൽ ചിലർ ദേ എൻഗേജ് ഇൻ ട്രേഡ്. ഗ്രാജുവലി ദേ അക്യുമുലേറ്റ് ക്യാപിറ്റൽ. ആ പണമാണ് വ്യാപാരം ചെയ്യുന്ന ആൾക്കാർ കടായിട്ട് വാങ്ങും. സോ ഇൻ ദ പ്ലേ മെർച്ചന്റ് ഓഫ് വെനീസ്, Antonio borrows money from a money lender called Shylock. Okay, he's a Jew. So such money lenders were also becoming established in cities. ഇത് മെഡീവൽ ഇംഗ്ലണ്ടിന്റെ അവസാനത്തെ കാലത്തെ ചരിത്രമാണ്. ബട്ട് ഇൻ ബിറ്റ്വീൻ this early medieval period and the late medieval period, life continued at a very slow pace, mostly based in villages. It is basically a rural structure. And the attitudes of the people. ബ്രിട്ടീഷുകാർക്ക് ഇപ്പോഴും കുറച്ച് ഫ്യൂഡലിസം ഉണ്ട് എന്ന് പറയാറുണ്ട്. അമേരിക്കക്കാരെ പോലെ അല്ല എന്ന് പറയാറുണ്ട്. ഓക്കെ, റെസ്പെക്ട് ഫോർ എൽഡേഴ്സ്, തറവാടിത്തം. നമ്മുടെ നാട്ടിൽ തറവാടിത്തമാണ്. തറവാടിത്തം എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ വലിയ ചില കുടുംബങ്ങളെ ഒരു മഹിമ ഉള്ള പോലെ പറയും. ഈ കുടുംബങ്ങളെയാണ് നമ്മൾ ബഹുമാനിക്കേണ്ടതെന്ന് പറയും. മോസ്റ്റ് ഓഫ് ദം ആർ ട്രഡീഷണലി ഓഫ് ലാൻഡ് ലോർഡ് ഫാമിലീസ് നമ്മുടെ നാട്ടിൽ. ഈ തറവാടിത്തം, ജന്മിത്തം, അതിൻ്റെതായിട്ടുള്ള ചില പ്രത്യേകതകൾ. സോ ദിസ് ഫൈൻസ് എക്സ്പ്രഷൻ ഇൻ ലാംഗ്വേജ് ഓൾസോ, ഭാഷയിൽ. അപ്പൊ ഭാഷയ്ക്ക് വന്ന മറ്റ് ചില കാര്യങ്ങൾ കൂടി ഇതിന്റെ കൂടെ നമ്മൾ ഓർക്കേണ്ടതാണ്. ഇറ്റ്സ് നോമനൈസേഷൻ. ഒന്ന്, the decreasing number of what we saw as irregular verbs. അതായത് what we call regular verbs which have three forms. Okay, fly, flew, flown, FLOWN. അത്തരം വാക്കുകളുടെ എണ്ണം പിന്നെയും കുറയുന്നതായിട്ട് നമ്മൾ കാണും. ഓക്കെ, ദി introduction of a particular use of the negative, okay, the use of a structure with not. Okay, I did not go എന്നാണ് നമ്മൾ ഇപ്പം പറയാം. അന്ന് പറഞ്ഞിരുന്നത് I went not എന്നാണ്. നോട്ട് അവസാനം ചേർത്തിട്ടുള്ള structure. It is still available in the English language, especially in poetry. അങ്ങനെ, in other words, the language underwent a complete overhaul under the influence of French. An overhaul which probably cannot be revived. അതിനി തിരിച്ചെടുക്കാൻ പറ്റാത്ത വിധം മാറിപ്പോയിട്ടുണ്ട്. It's so deeply entrenched. Its formal language is completely under the influence of French. ഇന്നും ഇംഗ്ലീഷിലെ ഔപചാരികമായ ഭാഷ, ഒരു ചടങ്ങിന് ഉപയോഗിക്കുന്ന ഭാഷ, ഒരു കോർപ്പറേറ്റ് പിന്നെ യോഗത്തിൽ ഉപയോഗിക്കുന്ന ഭാഷ, ഇതൊക്കെ തന്നെ all these are heavily influenced by French. ഒരു കാര്യം കൂടി ഞാൻ പറയാം. The French language exerted an influence over English in two different stages. The early French influence was from what we call the Norman French, French spoken in Normandy. പക്ഷെ അതല്ല ഫ്രാൻസിലെ ഔദ്യോഗിക ഭാഷയായി മാറിയത്. The official language of France was later on was the French spoken in Paris, not Norman French. അപ്പൊ എന്തുണ്ടായി? By the 15th century, France had also become a powerful kingdom, and cultural exchanges continued. So many words from French arrived in English even after the 16th century. France was a country of manners, fashion. Okay. ഏറ്റവും പുതിയ ഡ്രസ്, ഏറ്റവും പുതിയ കൺസ്യൂമർ ഗുഡ്സ്. സിഗരറ്റ് എന്നുള്ള വാക്ക് ഫ്രഞ്ച് ആണെന്ന് പറയേണ്ട ആവശ്യമില്ലല്ലോ. ലൈക്ക് കമീസ്, CHEMIS, പെറ്റിക്കോട്ട് എന്നുള്ളത് അതിന്റെ ഇംഗ്ലീഷാണ്, സ്ത്രീകളുടെ ഡ്രസ്. ഓക്കെ, പിന്നെ ഒരുപാട് വാക്ക്. ബ്ര ഇസ് ഫ്രഞ്ച്, ഫ്രം ബ്രസിയർ, BRASSIER. അപ്പൊ ഡ്രസ് തുടങ്ങിയിട്ടുള്ള പല കാര്യങ്ങൾ ഫ്രഞ്ചിന്റെ ഇൻഫ്ലുവൻസ് കാണാം ഈവൻ ആഫ്റ്റർ ദി 15th century. So two types of French, the Norman French and the Parisian French. The French used in Paris, which ultimately became the official language of France. അപ്പൊ ഈ രണ്ട് കൾച്ചറിന്റെയും ഒരു the kind of amalgamation, it continued, it became even stronger after the 18th century. നമ്മൾ ഇതിൽ വരുന്ന, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ നിങ്ങൾക്ക് ഓർക്കാൻ വേണ്ടി ഞാൻ പറയാം, with the romantic movement in English literature. The romantic movement was very closely related to the romantic movements in other parts of Europe. മാത്രമല്ല, France was a favored destination for travelers from England. ഫ്രാൻസിലും ഇറ്റലിയിലുമാണ് പോയത്. നമ്മളെ കവികളൊക്കെ എടുത്തു നോക്കുക, ഷെല്ലി, ഓക്കെ, ബൈറൻ, വേർഡ്സ്വർത്ത്, I don't remember whether he went for trips abroad. So foreign travel, കുറച്ച് അത്യാവശ്യം സാമ്പത്തികമുള്ള കുടുംബങ്ങളിലൊക്കെ ആൾക്കാർ ഫ്രാൻസിലും ഇറ്റലിയിലും സഞ്ചരിച്ചു at that time. Those were the first destinations, France especially. And up to the middle of the 20th century, French was the second language in Britain. നമ്മൾ ഇംഗ്ലീഷ് പഠിക്കുന്ന പോലെ തന്നെ അത്രയും സീരിയസ് ആയിട്ട് ഫ്രഞ്ച് പഠിച്ചത് ഇപ്പൊ ഉണ്ടോന്ന് അറിയില്ല, I don't know. If you read school stories written during the mid 20th century, you'll find that in almost every good school, നമ്മൾ ഇവിടുത്തെ നല്ല സ്കൂളുകളിലൊക്കെ ഉള്ള പോലെ അവിടെ there was a French teacher who was a native French citizen. അങ്ങനെയുള്ള ടീച്ചേഴ്സിനെയാണ് വെക്കുക. So all kinds of jokes would be played on. അവർ ഇംഗ്ലീഷ് പറയുന്നത് പ്രശ്നമായി, കാരണം they won't use plurals. But trousers, Malayalam trousers, in Britain, in English, it is plural. Glasses, Kannada, singular, Kannu, and singular. The British will also always say eyes. So trousers, even the names of some diseases are used in the plural. Measles, MEASLES. Take where the soccer. Ajampani na kuparina soccer. The English word is measles. So the French teachers will say measle. S as the French in French probably it is used in the singular. So French was still very popular in Britain until at least the middle of the 20th century. Okay. Today, of course, it might have lost its importance. Okay. So French is like any other European language, German. It does not have a cultural influence on Britain as it used to do once upon a time. So I think I have given you a picture of medieval England and Middle English. Yeah, this is how it happens. On the one hand, the transformation of the English language under Norman rule. അത് എങ്ങനെയാണെന്ന് നിങ്ങൾ കൃത്യമായിട്ട് പറയണം. ഏതൊക്കെ തലത്തിലാണ്? At the level of vocabulary, at the level of pronunciation, at the level of sounds, phonology. Okay. At the level of morphology, word formation, and that's the compounds become more frequent in the language. Okay. Sorry, compounds become less frequent in the language. Prepositions are on the increase. Inflections are decreasing. Norman influence on language is visible in all these areas. Okay. And also remember that medieval English is closer to our English. ഇന്നത്തെ ഇംഗ്ലീഷിൽ നമുക്ക് ചോസറിന്റെ കവിത മുഴുവൻ മനസ്സിലാവുന്നില്ലെങ്കിൽ ചില വരികളൊക്കെ മനസ്സിലാവും അല്ലേ? When April with his April with his surest sorte, the drugget of March has passed to the rote. കുറച്ച് മനസ്സിലാവും അല്ലേ? April with his sweet showers. കുറച്ച് സൂക്ഷിച്ചു വായിച്ചാൽ നമുക്ക് എന്തെങ്കിലും. But you cannot understand old English. അത് അത്രയും വ്യത്യാസം. അപ്പോൾ Chaucer's poem is at least partly legible to you. നിങ്ങൾക്ക് കുറച്ചെങ്കിലും വായിച്ചാൽ മനസ്സിലാവും Chaucer, because its language is closer to our language. പ്രൊനൗൺസിയേഷന്റെ കാര്യത്തിൽ ഒരുപാട് വാക്കുകൾ വ്യത്യാസമുണ്ട്, ഒരുപാട് വാക്കുകളുടെ ഉച്ചാരണം വ്യത്യാസമുണ്ട്. It has moved on. Middle English pronunciation is not our pronunciation. When you talk about pronunciation, remember that the word time, T-I-M-E, was pronounced time in medieval English. Up to Shakespeare's time, it was time. Now we pronounce it as time. And semantically also, കുറെ പഠിക്കാനുണ്ട്. പല വാക്കുകളുടെ അർത്ഥം മാറുന്നു. Fowl, F-O-W-L, only meant bird. The parliament of fowls, birds. Okay. Very commonly used in Chaucer's time. Okay. Kine, meaning cattle. അങ്ങനെ ഒരുപാട് വാക്കുകൾക്ക് ഇന്നുള്ള അർത്ഥമല്ല ചോസറുടെ കാലത്ത് ഉണ്ടായി. Or even before, in the early medieval. Chaucer occupies the middle medieval period. In all these areas of the language. Okay. And you can say that the Norman period or the Middle English period was the, let us say, foundational period of modern English language. English ഭാഷ ഉണ്ടായത് കാണുന്ന English ഉണ്ടായത് ആ കാലത്താണ്. ഓക്കെ, സോ I think with this introduction I will wind up with you and I will be sending you materials. ആ വീഡിയോസ് ഒക്കെ പിന്നെ കുറച്ച് വീഡിയോസ് അയച്ചിട്ടുണ്ട്. You can also look at other videos. You will find in some videos you will find remarkable similarities between medieval England and medieval Kerala. കേരളത്തിന്റെ മധ്യകാലം ഇപ്പൊ അവസാനിച്ചിട്ടുള്ളൂ. Up to the 1940s or 50s, Kerala lived in the medieval period. അതിപ്പോ ഇംഗ്ലണ്ടിൽ അന്നുണ്ടായിരുന്ന ജന്മിത്വം ഇവിടെ ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു. ജാതി വ്യവസ്ഥ ഉണ്ടാക്കിയ സമൂഹത്തിന്റെ പല തട്ടുകളായിട്ടുള്ള വിഭജനം ഇവിടെ ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു. അപ്പൊ ഞാനൊരു വീഡിയോ അയച്ചതായിട്ടൊരു വീഡിയോ മലയാളം ഡബിങ് ആണ്. അപ്പൊ ഹൗ ദി വില്ലേജ് വാസ് ടോട്ടലി അണ്ടർ ദി കൺട്രോൾ ഓഫ് ദി ലാൻഡ് ലോർഡ്. അപ്പൊ അദ്ദേഹത്തിന്റെ ഭൂമിയിൽ പണിയെടുക്കുന്ന ആൾക്ക് മകളുടെ കല്യാണം നടത്തണമെങ്കിൽ ജന്മിയുടെ അനുവാദം ചോദിക്കും. ഗ്രാമം വിട്ട് എന്തെങ്കിലും ആവശ്യത്തിന് പുറത്തേക്ക് പോകണമെങ്കിൽ ജന്മിയോട് ചോദിച്ചിട്ട് പോകാം. അപ്പൊ ഇന്ന് നിങ്ങളുടെ അച്ഛനോട് അമ്മയോട് വരെ ചോദിക്കാണ്ട് നിങ്ങൾക്ക് എവിടെ വേണമെങ്കിൽ പോകാൻ പറ്റുന്നത് ഇന്നത്തെ കാലത്ത്. അന്ന് അച്ഛനോട് അമ്മയോട് മാത്രം ചോദിച്ചാൽ പോലെ ജന്മിയോട് ചോദിക്കും. കേരളത്തിൽ അതേപോലെ കേരളത്തിലും ലൈക്ക് ഇൻ മെഡീവൽ ഇംഗ്ലണ്ട് പീപ്പിൾ യൂസ് ടു ബി ഫൈൻഡ്. പലർക്കും പിഴയൊക്കെ എടുക്കുന്നത്. അതൊക്കെ ഞാൻ അയച്ചിരുന്ന 1-2 വീഡിയോയിൽ കാണാം. സോ the study of the medieval period or the Middle English period in England is not just a study on the transformation of the English language under Norman influence. It is also a study of the transformation of English society under Norman rule. The stratification of feudalism. By stratification, I mean the organization of something into various layers. തട്ടായിട്ട് സമൂഹത്തിനെ വിഭജിക്കുന്നതിനാണ് സ്ട്രാറ്റിഫിക്കേഷൻ എന്ന് പറയുന്നത്. അത് the hold of the Catholic Church and the influence of the church on the language. അത് നിങ്ങൾ മറക്കരുത് കേട്ടോ. ഇംഗ്ലീഷ് ഭാഷയ്ക്ക് മതം സംഭാവന ചെയ്തത്. Many idioms in English are taken from the Bible. ബൈബിളിലാണ്. ബൈബിളിൽ നടത്തിയിട്ടുള്ള ഒരുപാട് പ്രയോഗങ്ങൾ ഇംഗ്ലീഷിൽ. യു ആർ ദ സോൾട്ട് ഓഫ് ദി എർത്ത്. യേശു പറഞ്ഞാണ് നീ ഭൂമിയുടെ ഉപ്പാകും. പിന്നെ നമ്പർ ഓഫ് അതർ idioms which are taken from the Bible. കൈ കഴുകുക അല്ലെ, ടു വാഷ് യുവർ ഹാൻഡ്സ് ഓഫ് ദ ബിസിനസ് അല്ലെ. നിങ്ങൾ ഒന്നും അറിയാതെ അത് വിട്ട് കളയുക. അത് കൈ കഴുകിയ ആളാരാണ്? ബൈബിളിൽ പിലാത്തോസ് അല്ലെ. യേശുവിനെ കുറിച്ച് തർക്കാനുള്ള വിധി പ്രഖ്യാപിക്കാൻ പറഞ്ഞ പിലാത്തോസ് അത് കഴിഞ്ഞിട്ട് കൈ കഴുകിയില്ലൊന്നൊരു പങ്കില്ല എന്നുള്ള അർത്ഥം. ഈ രക്തത്തിൽ എനിക്ക് പങ്കില്ല. സോ ദാറ്റ് ഇസ് അനദർ idiom commonly used to wash your hands off the business. Taken from the Bible. So the Bible is probably a large contributor to the English. And especially after the translations of Bible became popular. Up to the 14th century, you don't have Bible translations available. Ordinary people did not read the Bible. Okay. The Bible was only the property of the church. So they read it only in Latin, not in English. But by the end of the 14th century, Bible began to be translated into English. John Wycliffe partially translated the Bible at the end of the 14th century. Then from the beginning of the 14th century up to the beginning of the 17th century, a large number of translations appeared. And the translation of 1611, which is called the King James Bible, or the authorized version. That's the medieval period, it is at the beginning of the modern period. It has been a heavy influence on the English language. ഓരോ വീട്ടിലും ബൈബിൾ സൂക്ഷിക്കാൻ തുടങ്ങിയതിനു ശേഷം ഇംഗ്ലീഷിലുള്ള ബൈബിൾ. It was used in the church also. It was an Anglican Bible. അപ്പം remember that the development of the English language in the medieval period is paralleled by the changes in the society, in technology. Printing കണ്ടുപിടിച്ചത് medieval കാലഘട്ടത്തിലാണ്, the medieval period. ആരാണ്, who is the first English printer അറിയപ്പെടുന്നത്? Anybody?
William Caxton. William Caxton.
Gutenberg was the person who invented printing. Gutenberg was a German, but Caxton was British. Caxton imported printing machines from countries like Belgium, and I think it was in 1476 that the first book was printed in. Okay. അപ്പം പിന്നെ കാക്സ്റ്റന്റെ ഒരു കോൺട്രിബ്യൂഷൻ എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ കാക്സ്റ്റൺ വാസ് ദ വൺ ഹൂ സ്റ്റാൻഡർഡൈസ്ഡ് ഇംഗ്ലീഷ് സ്പെല്ലിംഗ്. ഓർക്കണം, കാരണം കാക്സ്റ്റൺ ഇല്ലായിരുന്നെങ്കിൽ ഇംഗ്ലീഷ് സ്പെല്ലിംഗ് ഇപ്പോൾ തന്നെ അത്ര സുഖമില്ല, ഇതിലും കച്ചറയാവുമോ ഇംഗ്ലീഷ്. സോ ഹി ഫോർ പ്രിന്റിങ് എ ബുക്ക് എന്ത് വേണം, അത് എല്ലാവർക്കും വായിക്കാൻ കഴിഞ്ഞാല് അതിന്റെ കോപ്പികൾ വേണ്ടത്ര ചെലവാകും. നിങ്ങൾക്ക് വേണ്ടത് അത്രയും കോപ്പിയല്ല. അപ്പൊ എന്ത് ചെയ്തു അദ്ദേഹം? ഹി ചോസ് one out of many available spellings. So not only spellings, but one out of many available language forms. So eyes, plural is s. You add the morpheme is and it becomes good. Eyes, eyes, cats, dogs. Okay. But not all words have the same root. For example, man, men, woman, women, okay, etc. Syllabus, syllabi. Syllabuses എന്ന് ഉപയോഗിക്കുന്നുണ്ട്, but syllabi is the more common. So, there are forms like oxen. Oxen കാളകൾ, രണ്ട് കാളകൾ കൂട്ടിക്കെട്ടുന്ന ox singular, oxen plural. So the use of en was also common in Caxton's days. iron, eyes എന്ന് ഇംഗ്ലണ്ട് ലണ്ടൻ ഭാഗത്ത് പറയുമ്പോൾ, in the northern part of England the plural form was in iron. Okay. Oxen, children ഇപ്പോഴും ഉണ്ട് ഇംഗ്ലീഷിൽ. അപ്പോൾ in some words the plural form n is still used. So Chaucer, where you had both forms available, Chaucer chose to take s. Therefore, in Caxton, in the books that Caxton printed, you have the plural form s. So printing was responsible in a large way to the standardization of English. What is happening during the medieval period? Let us take a bird's eye view. On the one hand, England was opening up to the continent. Okay. On the other hand, England was consolidating itself into a nation state. സ്വയം ഒരു ദേശരാഷ്ട്രം ആയിട്ട് ഇംഗ്ലണ്ട് വളരാൻ തുടങ്ങുന്ന കാലം, with a language of its own, English, distinct from French or German. അപ്പോ ഉള്ളിൽ നിന്ന് മാറ്റുക, പുറത്തുനിന്ന് കടം വാങ്ങുക, അതേസമയം സ്വന്തം വ്യക്തിത്വം നിലനിർത്തുക, retaining your identity. All these things were happening simultaneously in England. And so this is what is happening on the one hand. Second, the medieval period represented the march of English society towards the modern period. പഴയ ട്രൈബൽ സാമൂഹ്യ ഘടനയിൽ നിന്ന് മാറിയിട്ട് to adopting a feudal structure, then transforming the feudal structure into a modern societal structure by the end of the 15th century. ഒരുപാട് കാര്യങ്ങൾ. Invention of printing is one reason. ആളുകളെ, ദൂരെയുള്ള ആളുകളെ ബന്ധിപ്പിച്ചു. Increase in literacy. വിദ്യാഭ്യാസം കൂടിയിട്ട് ഈ പുസ്തകങ്ങൾ വായിക്കണമെങ്കിൽ അത്രയും വിദ്യാഭ്യാസം കിട്ടിയ ആളുകളാണ്. Standardization is an important principle in the growth of a language in the official organization of a language. Now, you must remember that even in the medieval period, there were different dialects of English. നല്ല ഒരു ഡസനോ അതിൽ കൂടുതലും ഉണ്ടാവും dialects. So like what we have in Malayalam today, കോഴിക്കോടൻ മലയാളമുണ്ട്, തിരുവനന്തപുരത്തെ മലയാളമുണ്ട്, വള്ളുവനാടൻ മലയാളമുണ്ട്, കണ്ണൂർ മലയാളം, കാസർഗോഡ് മലയാളം. So similarly, the dialects in medieval period were quite numerous. But 4 dialects are taken as important. Most important was the East Midland dialect, spoken in around London and the southeast part of England, including the coast. East Midland, West Midland, which is another dialect commonly used. Then Northern dialects used on the other side of the river Humber, Humber, northern part of England. Then, of course, Kentish. So these were the 4 dialects in the medieval, out of which the East Midland dialect was the most prominent. Chaucer's poem, as well as many other important works, were written in the dialect. One important work written in another dialect called the West Midland dialect was Langland's poem, Piers the Plowman. I think you have the poem. Poem പഠിക്കാനല്ലേ? Piers the Plowman. Has it been removed from your first paper? Chaucer to the 18th century?
Yes, sir, we have that.
You have it. So that was originally written in the West Midland dialect. Okay. And it did not become as popular as the East Midland dialect. The West Midland dialect was less popular than the East Midland dialect. Okay. So the East Midland dialect was the most prominent dialect during the period. And it was out of the East Midland dialect that modern English developed. Remember that. So the Wessex dialect was the most prominent dialect during the Old English period. And now, in the medieval period, it was the East Midland dialect. And then by the modern period, the dialect which became the modern period saw the standardization of English. ഒരു പ്രത്യേക ഡയലക്റ്റിന്റെ പേരല്ല പറയുന്നത്. We have a standard form of English developing from the 16th century. So, okay. So I think I'll wind up now. I have an audio recording of the whole class, which I'll send you. So if you have missed out on the online lecture, video lecture, you can definitely compensate for that by the audio lecture, which I'll be sending you. Okay, thank you. So we meet again next week. Okay, please do send me messages on materials that I use it, on any other doubts that you may have, things which I have dealt with today. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
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 Thank you, sir.